forests and the financing of forests, we really need to be able to look at the whole landscape and figure out where the financing is found or where it's missing. And if it's missing, then what do you do with it? Of course, my comments right now are addressing the private sector, the public sector, but this same situation is echoed in the private sector. Just as government agencies specialize in certain aspects, private sector firms and NGOs tend to mirror those areas. And forests, I think, the reason from Rio on, forests were a difficult area to cover was because of this complexity. So today, in our financing discussion, I'm hoping we see some of these issues come forward and we understand, if we don't understand the entire area, at least we start to understand where some of the gaps are and where the issues are. Forest financing, as you know, and as several speakers this morning underlined, was remarkably absent until the Bali Action Plan. And while Bali has focused on carbon finance in forests, REDD in other words, it has had undoubtedly an impact on creating more sources of financing for forests and their functions. However, it's also interesting to note that only 48 countries currently have REDD plus financing. I'll remind you that there are 192 countries in the United Nations, so you do the math. It means there are an awful lot of countries that are not getting support. And since forests and trees outside of forests cover a wide range of countries, there clearly is an issue about how this would be addressed. The United Nations Forum on Forests, for which I work, has, after 17 years of argument, and believe me, I know it's 17 years. My daughter was born in 1992, and I know just how difficult a teenager can be. This United Nations Forum on Forests had arguments since Rio about how to address forests and finance. At the end of 2009, the forum finally agreed to a process to analyze and assess forest finance, and not just forestry again, but the entire scope of finance related to forests, and made a decision, its own poison pill, if you will, to take a decision on the issue of forest finance in 2013 at UNFF 10. So the work that we're doing here is part of our work program to try to understand and assess where finance is, where it is missing, what are the institutional issues, what are the institutional opportunities.
Thanks, Jen. It's great to be here this afternoon, even though I can't see a thing out there. But I think there are people out there. I'm gonna try. You did pull a fast one on me. I was actually planning on taking advantage of what everybody else said and say, you know, what he said, what she said, and so on. But we'll go the other direction. I'm going to talk mainly about REDD plus, but I'm going to try and bring in some of the other 350 degrees or whatever is left out there to really look at this in total. I'm going to break it down into essentially a discussion on strategies, investments, and results. The first phase, strategies. This is kind of where we see that we are right now. The where, when, and how to reduce emissions and so on. The strategic approach, the reference levels. There's a tremendous amount of progress being made on understanding reference levels and identifying better ways of establishing references for looking at REDD plus. The MRV, again, progress being made there, how to measure, report, and verify. But the more that you dig into this, the more complex it gets, and the more you look at a 360 approach, the more complex it's going to be, but it's still needed. And then the institutions, and I think this is a critical area that we see in the readiness phase is having institutions that understand the issues, that are responsible, accountable for tackling, preparing for REDD, making sure that the forest communities, that indigenous peoples, that biodiversity values and so on are a part of the plan for moving towards REDD Plus, and bringing in the private sector at an early stage, because at the end of this thing, it's about money. That's why we're here today. The second phase on investments is a critical phase, and I think that in the early stages, let me just go back. This looks a little bit complex, but if you really get into the investments phase, this is where it really gets complex, and this is a gross oversimplification. There are a number of sectors that have to be looked at. We've had Agriculture Day yesterday, and about a month ago there was a major event in The Hague to talk about soil carbon and agriculture as related to climate change and food security. You're not going to tackle deforestation if you don't deal with agriculture. That's a reality. You're also not going to address the whole issue of drivers of deforestation and sustainable forest management if you don't bring into account the other sectors that influence the ability to actually manage forests and improve the productivity of forests and the landscape that's covered with forests. So it really is about a landscape approach at dealing with this challenge. And in some of the early stages, I think, in discussions on REDD, there was a little bit of a less of an emphasis than is required, thinking about how do you actually invest in the drivers of deforestation. The reality is that it was very exciting to think about entering into a contract where a government or a community is going to get paid for reducing emissions from deforestation, from REDD Plus. But the reality is, if the actual folks who live out there that are responsible for those forests or illegally taking advantage of those forests as resources, unless you deal with the rural livelihoods, the governance issues, and so on in a very multi-sectoral way, you're not going to actually achieve the objectives of REDD Plus anyway, from a climate perspective or any other perspective. And so this is actually very critical, and in terms of the money behind this, this is a huge, huge investment required in a number of countries. The third phase is on results, and I'm not going to go into this in detail, but I think that what we're going to see as we start experiencing major payments for reducing emissions from deforestation, we'll see a gradual increase in our ability to really understand the inputs, the proxies, verified emission reductions, and so on. But there's a huge amount of work to be done in this area. Just very quickly, in terms of where the money comes from for each of those, and we are, I'm looking at this primarily as a public sector institution and our experience, but there's tremendous potential to increase the players here. But as of today, you've got dedicated funding for the strategies, investments, and results. The strategies would be mostly the readiness work that's being done by governments, FCPF, the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility, UNRED, the GEF, bilaterals, multilaterals, and so on. The investments, this is where the big money is going to have to come fast before you see a huge payment for performance-based payment for REDD, and this money is going to have to come from all these sources. One fairly innovative, we think, approach is the Forest Investment Program, because in that program, which is under the Climate Investment Funds, that program has a dedicated amount for indigenous peoples to see whether we can actually accelerate the on-the-ground work for addressing drivers of deforestation by going directly to those communities. And then the results side, this is very much an open book right now. Clearly, there's discussions here in Cancun. Is this going to be a market-based mechanism, or is it purely going to be bilateral deals? I mean, there's a huge uncertainty right now around how the performance-based payments are going to be made. What's probably the way this picture should really look is to have a return curve coming from the results into the investments, because the reality is that a great deal of the income from performance-based REDD Plus needs to be sunk right back into the dealing with the drivers of deforestation. So this isn't just really income earned. This is money that should go directly into drivers of deforestation. And in some time in the future, then it really is income earned, performance-based income earned. But it's going to take a long time and a lot of money to invest in the drivers of deforestation. The earlier we can get performance-based payments to countries and to communities so that they can invest in those drivers, and you'll see a snowball effect, I think, in terms of the impact on reducing emissions from deforestation. Then finally, just a little bit about where the money is that we see right now. The FCPF has a reasonable amount for the readiness work, $210 million. We're working on the results side, the payment for reductions for REDD. Right now, it's $145 million. We hope to build that up a little higher. UNRED is at about $111 million. The FIP, which I mentioned, is about $560 million right now. And then the GEF is actually probably, this is an understatement, because the $250 million that's dedicated to REDD is actually each dollar that goes out triggers 3 more. So this is $1 billion at least, and probably when you look at co-financing will be more. And then finally, it's really important that there are a lot of players. I think there's plenty of room for everybody in this area anyway, but it is going to be important that we all try and deliver as one so that we have consistent methodologies. And we're seeing this in terms of readiness work strategies, how the investments will work, and then the results-based actions. It's very important that we communicate, collaborate, and make sure that these come together. And my final point would be that as issues like agriculture come more into this area of work, or biodiversity conservation, we need to really bring these communities together. And so I guess the final point would be that maybe next year, instead of having Forest Day, Agriculture Day, and Ocean Day, we ought to have Landscape Day, and then we can tackle all these things in one area. I'll close with that. Thank you very much.
Well, good evening. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to be talking a little bit about forest financing from a broad perspective and also from BNDES point of view. We have in BNDES the Amazon Fund, which was a tremendous breakthrough in the institution. It brought a new focus, and it certainly introduced big changes in the institution. But not necessarily just that. BNDES in itself was already moving in the direction of taking care of a territory like the Amazon and trying to develop a region taking care of forest. The world now is discussing the possibility of having a global forest fund. I think that's very important and necessary, but eventually the message that I want to give is it's important to have a local presence, a local institutionality, to a local institutional framework to develop forest financing, the sustainable development of forest areas. But it's also important to have an institution that has the ability to move forward locally and provide some of the externalities that this demands. So it's not just providing funds, you have to have an overall approach, and this is what I would like to talk about today. The bank deals with the Amazon Fund, we are dealing with the projects, we're getting results, but there's a lot more than just that. The bank was appointed as the manager of the Amazon Fund. Just to give you a picture of the size of the bank, it's a 60-year-old institution. It has been financing the different sectors of the economy. It has long-term credit, the biggest provider of long-term credit in the Brazilian economy, equity holder, the largest equity holder, and we deal with project finance in different areas. And so we are about the size of the World Bank, and in assets and in terms of disbursements, we disbursed last year 74 times the size of the World Bank. So in terms of Brazil, this produces some results, and the policies of the bank in one way or another condition and lead the Brazilian economy. So, and the bank now, I think what the very important thing, the bank is changing its internal mindset, and it's trying to bring this to the Brazilian economy. Internally, the bank deals, and we're trying to point this out, to a quintuple bottom line. People talk about the triple bottom line, we deal with the financial, the social, the environmental, but it's very important now to introduce into this equation innovation and the territorial integration. Sustainability is something that's dynamic, so you have to be analyzing the projects and the companies from a very broad approach, and the territorial integration of the Amazon region is very important. So the bank is looking at this already. We introduced something which is beginning to be important. When we analyze projects now, we do a first analysis of the intangibles of the project, of the company. And in this, we consider everything, the whole sustainability. And this affects the rating of the company, and it ends up affecting the cost of credit. So it's important to have an overall approach and bring the Brazilian economy to be sustainable in a dynamic fashion. We have a social area, 20-year-old social area, so we're used to looking at small populations, small projects, and in the Amazon this is very important. And there's so many transversal committees that to change the mindset of our analysts, of the bank, people who work at the bank. Maybe if in the past we were spending 90 or 100% of our time looking at the financials or at the risks parameters of projects, now we're spending at least half of our time looking at the social environmental issues, and this is very important. This conditions the way we should approach the whole thing. In terms of, last year, an environmental area was created with a few departments. One of them is looking at knowledge. We want to develop knowledge in terms of environmental issues, social environmental issues, many different areas, water, forest, charcoal, things like that. And we're trying to define baselines for the whole of the Brazilian economy, saying that if sector by sector, we divided the Brazilian economy into 26 sectors, we are doing a guide for our analysts that creates all the necessary conditions, the sustainable social environmental conditions that must be met and must be pursued when we analyze projects. And we also creating a credit policy that will incentivize or punish or constrain companies to move in the right direction. And this is also has to be constructed, not only, we want to do this with society, our guides will be public very soon. We want to be hearing constantly from society what are the important issues in each sector and what we should be addressing and what we should be pushing in terms of our credit policy and our regulatory policy. And we should be also influencing other bodies in regulation to move in the same direction. It's very important to develop a self-regulatory body in Brazil. I mean, the definitions of the baselines and where the baseline should be going should be done with society. So it's very important to have self-regulatory institutions, federations of industries, class associations, defining those parameters with everybody so that things that are requested are doable and you can execute them and get there at a certain time. It's very important also to change the mindset in terms of accounting. We are Brazil and the world, everybody's considering just GDP growth. We have to go to sustainable growth. We need new indicators. We need not savings, we need genuine savings. We need another way of looking at things, and if this sets in, then all the actors in the economic arena will start moving in the right direction. And just to give an example, we started last year in this area. The bank decided to use part of its profit that we always use for social things and use for technical purposes and for a social area. And somebody mentioned last year, let's planting trees provides jobs. It's social, let's do something. So we decided to try to do a forest program to recover the forest biome in Brazil. Forest biome is reduced to 7% of its original territory. And our projects, when we started doing our projects, we got together and we found that there was a lot of people, the Pacto of Mata Atlântica, a group of institutions that got together trying to do the same thing. When we started doing our project, what we found out, when you do a land recovery project in a small county, for example, you need to introduce a plant nursery. A plant nursery hires 60 to 80 persons. Then you have in the upstream process, you have people who gather seeds. These people today are getting 2 minimum wages in Brazil collecting seeds, a lot more than they were getting before in their subsistence day-to-day activities. And then the downstream process that people planting trees. So when you do a small project like that, with a small amount of money, you can create a great amount of jobs. In some communities, everybody's jobless. I mean, it's possible to change the economics of great area of Brazil. We're talking about the Atlantic biome, but we can be talking about all the other biomes, creating a program to generate forests, recover the lost forests, and creating jobs. And once the forests are up, you can create a forest economy. So when we talk about green financing, we're always talking about nanotechnology, solar panels, and those things, but eventually it's down-to-earth things that also occur in Brazil. The other thing that we're doing, we have a green financing department which tries to bring the money, the savings that float around the Brazilian economy to invest in green projects. And why we're doing this is creating the conditions, the securities, and the instruments that will make this happen. And with the baselines, also trying to raise the baselines, you give the money and provide the constraints, you're able to bring this to occur. Give you examples of direct operation. We have an equity, the bank is an equity holder of the Brazilian economy, and just we are investing in some sectors like forests, chemical industry, some social, environmental sectors that have importance in environmental terms. But recently we invested, just about last week actually, in a forest. The bank became an investor of a very large forest management project together with 2 private equity funds and a German fund. And for the first time, we're going to have in Brazil a very large forest management project. We hope to bring this to list this in the stock exchange very soon. It will be very significant. It provides a lot of return. And investors who were never looking at this started considering this as a long-term investment with good returns. And one thing that I want to point out, and when we analyze this, we value the forest for the forest management. It's a forest management, sustainable forest management project. And they will also get wood processing, and they will get higher value from the wood processing thing. This process is what we value as for return. And the forest products, or the carbon credits, and I forgot the word, I'm sorry, biodiversity of the forest is not being valued in. I mean, the forest owners, at this moment, we still don't have the instruments to price in, and that could be a significant amount of value. For BNDES, that was an upside, a free upside. But I mean, in the future, it's very important that this becomes valuable because communities will be the owners of biodiversity, and they must have the instruments for that to be valued. At the moment, we got a very nice project, and we got some free lunch because the owners of this project we couldn't find a way of valuing those things. In private equity funds, the bank now has a CDM fund, which is it's a $354 million fund investing in forest. In companies that commit themselves to get carbon credits, and we get investing in forests also to private equity funds. So we're beginning to have investors who never looked at this area get into that. And we have some fixed income products, we have green securities that will stimulate the generation of green products. And just comment one of them is the carbon efficient index. It was launched last week in Brazil and will be presented here tomorrow. This index uses the Brazilian benchmark, the stock market, and convinced all the companies in the index to calculate the carbon inventories and shifting the inventories, the index according to sales of the companies. We got a new index that tracks the original index and provides 26% savings. And we're going to sell an ETF in the Brazilian market. This is going to be a tradable product, and people will be able to buy a green security, a green index. And maybe the next development that we want to do that brings attention, could bring attention to forest and to REDD is this. Everybody's doing the GHG protocol, and this is the standard in the world, level 3. And we think that it makes a lot of sense. Maybe next year, once the index is running, we can change and create the GHG plus protocol, in which compensation, some portion of compensation could be introduced into this methodology. If this is accepted, you will generate a large amount of interest of money flowing to REDD projects from the big companies who are in the stock markets compensating their emissions. So there are financial instruments that could bring things to money to the market and start the market going. There's the Amazon Fund. I'm not going to talk a little more because I think we're short of time. I just want to say, just want to point out one thing. The Amazon Fund can only raise money if we commit and keep reducing the deforestation in Brazil. Brazil has committed to reducing 80% of deforestation. We have to look at an institutional framework in Brazil that was mentioned in the beginning. We have to follow a lot of guidelines. The Brazil government, the states and the municipalities are committing themselves to creating the institutional framework to help reduce the deforestation. We have governors, we have committees who create guidelines. And the big thing is that we have the national commitment, they have the local expertise. The country must produce results. That's a must for order to manage a fund like the Amazon Fund. And the region must achieve sustainability. At the end, there's no Amazon Fund and the region must go on itself. There are many areas of action towards the Amazon Fund. Science and technology, forests have so much to bring out, and we have the challenge to bring that out, to value all of this. And one thing that's important is also we have a logical framework, and the idea is not just reducing deforestation. We have to have an overall approach towards a region that has a forest, and that is reducing deforestation, but also having the sustainable development of the region, and that includes creation of jobs, a whole array of things that the Amazon Fund has to be doing. We have some projects I'm going to skip that we already approved. Just to comment, just the last 3 ones. We have a museum in the Amazon region, which will be a very scientific, state-of-the-art thing that will provide you visibility on a live museum. You can visit and you can see what's going on in the forest. You have the Tropical Forest Project, which is the next last one, which provides forest management capacity and technology development for the region. And the last one, which is interesting, is it's a university project in which they're going to be mapping, social mapping. You're going to get 80 populations in the Amazon region, and they're going to map their history and link it to their territory and bring out their knowledge to everybody. These are the areas that are beginning to be covered by some of the projects. These are the museum and the other, covers a large portion of the Amazon, the 80 peoples who live around the different populations. This is the territory that has projects already covered by the Amazon Fund. We have 75 projects in the pipeline, challenges, and just the last thing, we just have to deal with the Amazon Fund as a total system, and the approach must be overall. We have to deal with all the different aspects of the challenges of the region. And the big thing, I'm taking this from the UNFF homepage, the enabling environment. The idea is to create an institutionality in the Amazon region, legality, institutions that have the ability to create projects, manage projects, report on projects, and develop and know what they want. That's what we really want. And at the outset, the Amazon Fund was leaving the Amazon region, going by itself, and so I think I'll stop here. Well, thank you.
Well, it's really an honor to be here today, particularly with this panel. And I mentioned some of the things, not to the details Sergio did, that Brazil has started, which I think is one of the most encouraging things about the forest story, because Brazil, Indonesia, China, India, and certainly South Africa, this sounds like I'm talking about a cabal in the climate talks, are actually embracing the future. And for us to solve the climate problem, protect our forests, and optimize our forests, we do need to embrace the future. I will say, some of the data I present in this presentation was developed for us, tailored for the UN Foundation's work on core elements or building blocks of a climate agreement that would actually lower greenhouse gas emissions by 17 gigatons by 2020. So this was an ambitious effort that we prepared for Copenhagen. We believe it is still relevant, and I'm only discussing the forest element of that analysis today. As you know, our existing forests are playing a very vital role in offsetting many of the carbon emissions that go into the atmosphere annually. But every piece of deforestation undercuts that ability for the biosphere to actually rebalance itself. So if we are going to make the natural processes of the earth work well, we have to address the human impact and the drivers of deforestation. This effort to mitigate and adapt to climate change, because we're all adapting, whether we like it or not, is a century-long effort. We're 10 years into the new century, so it's encouraging to see a number of countries working hard on the challenge. In our scenario, we looked at how much of this 17 gigaton challenge would come from agriculture and forestry. And the McKinsey Project Catalyst work indicated that 6 to 7 gigatons would come from forest and agriculture. And the cost, and this gets to some of the numbers that the World Bank and Brazilian National Development Bank have put on the table here. The cost, we think, for this effort would be $51 billion. So you see, even though we're mobilizing a lot of money to the forest agenda between now and 2020, that's, you know, only a small portion of what we need to spend. So this is the challenge in front of us, and for forests that works out to a price of $7 to $8 a ton. So here's what Project Catalyst did for us, and as you see, they have basically indicated the deforestation reductions that particularly what Brazil is talking about and Indonesia, how important those are to this overall calculation. Because we have not made the same investment in agriculture, we're not going to get as much out of agriculture in the early years, but agriculture ultimately will be key to this. So the long-term goal is to develop a broad landscape methodology for agriculture, forestry, and other land use change to optimize what we're doing in terms of managing the land for optimal carbon calculation. We could not do all the adjustment we needed to do in terms of our capital reshaping as we sought a low carbon economy without lower cost emission offsets. Forests were the key to managing our overall investment. And since, you know, over the long period of time it's taken us to put Kyoto into force and unfortunately in this period the United States stood on the sidelines. In the United States we continued to work on the forest issue because we continue to see it as one of the key building blocks long-term to both addressing the climate problem and also addressing other issues, particularly sustainable development in countries with large forest reserves. Chicago Climate Exchange and the history as it developed as the European trading system came into being. Government-supported regimes became the gold standard, and industrial emissions, this is our problem. We still value industrial emissions at a much higher level because we can measure them. The price evolution you see in this phenomenon of forest carbon and other carbon assets is certainly a result of the uncertainty of markets, the newness of markets, the size of the markets, and the leakage that goes on. Forest credits particularly are high risk and low cost. Just to give you a sense of what's happening in the voluntary market, and you can see that failure in Copenhagen impacted heavily as we went forward and avoided deforestation. That means keeping your forest intact is among the lowest priced options for forest carbon. The bank has already talked a lot about REDD readiness. I think this is essential. We have huge gaps in knowledge, but people are starting to fill those gaps, and certainly Brazil is in the forefront of that. I would like to stress, however, that the dilemma we face is values are so imprecise still for forest carbon. It's going to be hard to build a market, and it's going to be doubly hard if you don't have more economy-wide cap and trade regimes that actually depend on forest or lower cost offsets. And as long as forest conservation commands the lowest price in the market, carbon trading alone is not going to address the forest and deforestation challenge. So I've talked a lot about why carbon markets are not delivering, so we will still need donor support for a lot of forest programs in the next decade. I think Brazil has shown you can start to build your own information base, develop new markets and new instruments to finance forest carbon. Among the incentives one can think about are clearly certification programs for good behavior, public-private partnerships, sustainable harvest programs. Some of the forests we have today are going to be used and reforested. We have to incorporate agroforestry as well as conservation forestry into our regimes. And I just want to flag, I think it's critical for sectoral development at a national level of cap and trade or trading regimes to build our understanding of how offsets can work to everyone's advantage, even at a local level. REDD has obviously been a response to the expectation a big market would exist in the United States. Without that, we're going to have to find new ways to explore and develop the potential of carbon offsets, but we're going to actually pay for other forest services as well which is why I'm glad Pavan Sukhdev is here. He can tell us how to do that. I just like to say I think we're going to need new financial instruments or old financial instruments with the forest focus. We're going to have to figure out how to structure new bonds. We're going to have to develop long-term payments. And there is, I think, an opportunity for thinking about banking and borrowing in forest carbon as part of national mitigation strategies. Thank you.
A friend of mine once described, after I had spent like half an hour trying to explain to him how exactly REDD+ might be structured in all its wondrous complexities, he said, "My God, this is really an intelligence test for humanity." And I have to confess, I would agree with him. This is definitely a complex subject, and I'd just like to begin with the good news that even though most of what I spend the next 5-6 minutes describing is about mechanism structuring, there are at least 4 worries that need not cloud the issue. So let me begin with the good news by saying that I'm not a believer that fungibility is a problem. By fungibility, what I mean is that people somehow feel that just because there is green carbon or carbon coming effectively out of forest-based or agriculture-based sequestration, somehow the pricing must be identical with, and it must be replaceable by, the pricing of carbon that's coming out of industrial processes being controlled. In other words, for example, out of the current EU ETS mechanism. The reason I'm not worried about this is because I see an alternative energy market called oil, which has very happily for the last 33 years, from what I can remember, traded 2 completely different benchmarks. There's WTI, that's West Texas Intermediate, and there's Brent crude, North Sea oil effectively. And these 2 benchmarks in oil have traded quite happily with a spread between them. These are both light sweet crudes, so they're basically the same, similar thing, very similar, except that one comes from the North Sea, the other comes from landlocked locations. And in all my years at Deutsche and before that at ANZ, I've been involved with energy traders and commodity traders, and not once has anyone ever complained to me, "Oh my God, there's a fungibility problem, what will we do?" Well, guess what? You will trade the basis, that's what you will do. These are not things that you need to worry about. It is okay for there to be 2 prices for 2 different types of carbon. That's fine. Markets will find their level. And the challenge is how to ensure that there is enough depth, enough liquidity. So that's problem number 1, which I'd like to define out of existence for you. Fungibility is not a problem. The other thing that people sometimes worry about is how will we decide whether or not to have offsets? Well, let me take that problem away from you. Offsets are not a choice. You have to have offsets. No choice, right? The choice is at what level are you going to design offsets? In other words, what kind of regime will there be? Will it be something that adds to the existing system? Because we do know that part of the reason why carbon prices are not where we'd like them to be, or where common sense suggests they ought to be, is because caps are too lenient. Cap and trade is the basic approach that we've adopted, and if caps are lenient, then you can trade away to glory till kingdom come, but you will not get the right price because you created too much supply. It's a little bit like a central bank flooding the markets with too much money. You won't get the right interest rates. The other main reason I think why offsets are not a choice is that even though I'm not by any means a believer that everything should be offset or 100%, the reality is that fiscal purses are not infinite, and you may begin by funding these markets for a while through fiscal means. The reality is that at some point you will have to telescope that demand down to the constituents, which effectively means corporations and private interests, who will then have to, within various mechanisms, pay for these offsets. And that is the right way forward. Recognizing that offsets are not a choice at some level, and the answer could be 10, 20%, or 30% of the total. After all, 2/3 of emissions are from industrial sources, only 1/3 are really from what you may call landscape or agricultural or forestry, the LULUCF genesis. Going with that is okay. And if you do accept these basic issues as not being issues, then the third issue also disappears, which is the fear of flooding. And frankly, today, if I look at what we have in terms of there being a genuine problem with originating REDD+ projects, the problem is a lack of supply. It's not too much supply. It's not as if there will be billions and billions of CERs which will flood the marketplace because you've got too many projects. Right now, we have too few projects, too few opportunities, in fact. Now, let me come to the other aspects of this mechanism structuring, which fundamentally it means who are going to be the participants in the REDD+ scheme, what eventually gets dollars, what gets paid, and how that payment gets measured. Warren talked about the performance side of it, which is the end game. How do you measure performance? What will get paid? The first point I'd like to make is, as has been made by a few speakers before, is that carbon is just one of the many ecosystem services that forests deliver, and indeed that other landscapes will deliver. And there are other ecosystem services. And we have to be cognizant of the fact that the community benefits a lot from forests in terms of access, which enables them to get non-timber forest products, but also in terms of nutrients and fresh water and other ecosystem services which come to them. So there's value being delivered out there which needs to be kept, and I think these recognitions are important. In addition to the benefits to the community, there are also benefits to species. The World Bank colleagues and myself have been talking about using apex species as indicators, tiger counts, for instance, as indicators, and you can reward on the basis of that the species component of maintenance of forests. So away from what are the other ecosystem services also is the question of who is going to be eligible on the buy side, in other words, who is basically buying carbon storage, and on the sell side, in other words, who is providing carbon storage and providing other ecosystem services. And I think this is an important question to recognize that there are both eligibility criteria apply both on the buy side and the sell side. If countries do not have the capacity, if they do not have the means of ensuring appropriate measurement and management, then eligibility is a problem. Conversely, if on the buy side, countries do not have the means and pockets and constituents, in other words, the corporates, who can afford to purchase green carbon credits or REDD+ credits, then that also is a question on eligibility. And extending from that, in terms of who is eligible, we must recognize that there have to be on what I call the sell side, in other words, where countries are providing carbon storage and other benefits, there has to be a degree of layering which we have to honestly accept cannot ever be either just at a country level or even at a state level. It has to go down to the community or the project level. At the end of the day, it's quite difficult for a country to be able to manage its carbon account, so to speak, if that is the only thing it's managing, to do so without the collaboration of the states which comprise the country, and equally difficult for the state to manage its carbon account without the collaboration and participation of its constituents, right down to the project level. And this is why I think all three layers have to be recognized and reflected. If we recognize and reflect that, then we will come to the next conclusion, which is that you need financing to be nested. And by nesting, what I mean is that you need to ensure that payments at the project level, if it's a successful project and if you've structured it correctly, should proceed even if there is not success at the state level. In other words, if there is a landscape or an area where some projects have been successful, that just because the overall state has not succeeded in its performance, that doesn't mean that the successful project should be penalized for that failure. And equally, therefore, contiguous states as part of a country which have succeeded in achieving their performance targets should not be penalized simply because the country as a whole did not manage to meet its performance targets. So this layering requires some money to be kept aside at each of these points, at the country for the states and at the state for the projects. And that kind of nesting really has to be part of the mechanism structure. Finally, the whole issue is, again, as part of structuring, and this is what I mean, mechanism structuring is the key. It makes or breaks success. We have to see this as happening in phases, and there's a lot of debate, and I really don't know why, between should it be fund or should it be market. I don't see this as an alternative. I see these as sequenced You need to begin with a fund phase, and then you gradually move towards a market phase. Which takes me to my next point, which is again one of the things that people worry about, is that how will we negotiate the right performance reference levels? Well, if you allow this to be a market mimicking system, in other words, an open architected system, which begins by bilateral negotiations, as indeed we see happening. After all, we are beginning to see money of the order of $4.5 billion beginning to be allocated between participants. Then clearly those negotiations, those bilaterals, will set their own prices. There will be reference levels set either on the basis of history or on the basis of projections or on the basis of current levels of emissions. And that will create a scatter diagram of prices, if you like, which will then eventually graduate towards a marketplace. That's how new markets do begin. Now I come to the next layer of complexity of this challenge, which is, of course, the landscape, which is that we are headed towards, and I think there seems to be an acceptance that we are headed towards very much a terrestrial carbon system. But you can't jump to that, because today the means of measuring even something like forests is hardly there. It's only beginning to get there. So, of course, we want to go to terrestrial carbon, but you need to begin somewhere. So therefore, you need to begin with forest carbon. And within forests, I think there's an equity argument for beginning with tropical forest carbon, because that's where most poverty is. And it is a fact that 1/4 of the carbon on land is stored in tropical forests. So there's no criticism of beginning there, but you need to build in order to go elsewhere. You need to build a system in order that it can become eventually a landscape-based system, so that contiguous landscapes, which include forests, which include silvipastoral systems, which include agroforestry, include contiguous agricultural areas, also can be included at the end of the day. And that's where the complexity really gets daunting, because measuring carbon content that is stored and measuring increases and decreases is not straightforward by any means. I don't think we have enough technology, but it's improving. Every year I keep hearing about new advances in measurement, and I think there's good news in that respect. So complex is mechanism structuring. Who is going to do this? How are we going to build capacity in countries? How will we rationalize all of these aspects of ecosystem services, of community benefits, of carbon itself, within the overall context of national biodiversity strategies and action plans, within the overall context of forest action plans? Well, this is basically where the rubber hits the road. We need to do that. And even if it is to begin with 10 countries or 20 countries, where we begin to focus on getting these measurements organized, on getting these policies in place, I think that's really where the direction has to be. That capacity building has to be the first focus. And I'm delighted to see that with the efforts of several initiatives, not least the UN REDD program, but also the World Bank Forest Carbon Partnership, and of late also the Interim REDD Plus partnership, that these capacities are beginning to be built. So I'm afraid mechanism structuring, simple term, but just look how complex it is. And yet that is the direction we need to go if we need to get this whole area organized and deliver equitable benefits to communities and to the people who are stakeholders of forests and of other landscapes, including agricultural and pastoral landscapes. So there is no simple answer. But the reality is that unless we recognize this complexity and start framing it and start explaining it to the participants, both on the buy and the sell side, I'm afraid there will not be progress. This is not a straightforward marketplace. It is best not to suggest that there are easy solutions. But at the same time, I remain optimistic that gatherings such as these, where we can flesh out and thrash out these ideas in the open, are a great opportunity to get movement forward. So I hope that I've not discouraged everyone at this late stage in the game, but I think it's important that we recognize the complexity, recognize that yes, this is the ultimate intelligence test of mankind, and that we do stand more than a 50% chance of passing this test. Thank you very much.
Hello everyone. It's very nice to have a chance to give you a brief introduction about China's strategy and financing for forestry sustainable development. So now forestry has been taken as an important initiative to the National Sustainable Development Strategy and the principal role for constructing the eco-civilization, the strategic choice for addressing climate change, and a special approach to rural development and poverty alleviation. So the strategy and objectives of forestry development is to rehabilitate and protect forestry ecosystems, and construct advanced forest industrial system, and developing flourish forest ecoculture system to increase forest multi products and services, and to meet the multi demands of the society, and to alleviate poverty and improve the livelihood of people relying on forests. And since 1998, China initiated a series of national key forestry programs, which have been all taken into the National Economic and Social Development Plan. So to rehabilitate and protect forest ecosystems by the natural forest protection programs and the conversion of cropland to forest program and the key shelter belt forest programs along the middle and the lower reaches of Yangtze River and along the coastal areas, and to combat the desertification by the programs like key shelter belt development program in the 3 North and the certification control program in vicinity of Beijing and Tianjin city, and the shelter belts around the farmlands and pastures, and the program on integrated combating land desertification in coastal regions, and protect and restore the wetlands ecosystem by the program Wetlands Conservation and Rehabilitation, and conserve biodiversity by the program of Wildlife Conservation and Nature Reserve Development, and also to increase the timber supply by the program of industrial-based forest development program, including that is the fast-growing and high-yield timber plantations. That's the program's main actions. And for the meantime, China try to improve the policies and the mechanisms to promote the sustainable forest management, like establish the compensation system for forest environmental service. That's start from the year 2001. After 3 years pilot, since year 2004, the Central Compensation Fund was formally established. So it has reached to 7.58 billion RMB in the 2010. The subsidies to support sustainable forest management since the year 2009, and give subsidy to the middle and young age standing tending, and subsidize the interest of loan for rescue the forest disasters and forestry development projects post 10-year reform, and subsidize forest insurance with national and provincial fee subsidy. That's pilot in 6 provinces since the year 2009, and support loan mortgaged forest property and microcredit for forestry development used by farmers' households, and initiate national compulsory tree planting campaign, and promote forest tenure reform both in collective forest tenure regions and pilot in state-owned forests, and provide preferential taxation and fees for forest and product processing to attractive the private sectors and individuals to input forestry. So, since between 1999 to the year 2009, the annual average afforestation is about more than 5 million hectares, and the investment from 1998 to year 2009 increased 10 times. So by the end of year 2008, the forest areas increased to 195 million hectares, and the coverage reached to more than 20%. And also the forest stock volume increased much, and plantation forests cover more than 62 million hectares and ranks the top in the world. And that is assessment by the FAO. So you can see between year 2005 and 2010, the forest areas increased fastest as in China. So the main experience for China, what is the administration? The forest sector totally in charge of the protection of construction we call ecosystems. You can see the function of the task of forestry sector in China. That's to establish and protect the forest ecosystem and manage and rehabilitate the wetland ecosystem and improve and combat the desertification ecosystem, and also maintain and increase the biodiversity. So the second experience is to the development. The forestation and reforestation and forest conservation and sustainable forest management are given equal attention and implemented simultaneously to increasing resources along with improving quality and boosting the economic outputs. And for the objectives is to realize multiple benefits of forests to meet the diverse requirements. And for the measurements, for national key programs primarily, and supplemented by the nation's compulsory tree planting and corporate social responsibility and other participation. So for the finance, the mainly relying on government finance, and meanwhile improving the policy environment for enabling and encouraging the social capital inputs. Concerning the REDD plus mechanism, so just as I mentioned, since 1980 to the year 2009, China starting the natural forest protection program. That's reducing the deforestation and protect the natural forest, has totally invest about 15 billion US dollar and protecting 107 million natural forests and reducing the consumption by 336 million cubic meters. And meanwhile, China also sent the Central Compensation Fund for the payment of environmental service. From the year 2001 to 2010, totally input about 5 billion US dollar, which covering about 70 million million hectares. So although we have do a lot, but still feel a lot of problems and challenges. For example, the aggregate forest resources are not adequate, and the forest quality is poor, and management workload is very heavy. And afforestation and reforestation and forest management is increasingly difficult. So I don't want to give read the number. You can see the problems and enormous pressure for poverty alleviation and increasing the timber supply. So more than 150 million populations is still belong in the UN poverty line. So in which about 70% of people rely on the forests, and more than 80% of the total state-owned forest farms still not get rid of the poverty. And the barriers on institutions and the mechanism for the sustainable forest management is still ongoing. Although we have started the collective forest tenure reform since the year 2008 and haven't finished in whole countries, and the state-owned forest reform is still on pilot phase. That means we still feel some barriers and the mechanism for the forestry because sustainable development. And concerning the REDD+ in post-Kyoto area, so I think the significant function of forests mitigating and adapting to climate change should be emphasized, and equal importance should be attached to reduce emission by both REDD and PLUS. And China's contribution through fast and large-scale afforestation and reforestation, increasing the forest resources and conservation to addressing the climate change should be recognized. And we also need assist to establish a national technical support system for evaluating and monitoring the carbon sequestration by forests. So thank you very much for your attention.
To all the panelists for their presentations. I'm a little bit surprised. We have heard a lot about financing for REDD and mitigation, and a little bit about ecosystem services and possibilities of markets for ecosystem services. At least I have heard less about how to pay for the cost of vulnerability of the forest, how to promote schemes for perhaps payments for environmental services and adaptation, or funding for adaptation mechanisms in the forest. And I would like to know if your institutions are working on it and finding financing options for adaptation in the forest. Thank you.
So the question is how to pay for ecosystem services, and are the institutions here doing that? I might ask Dr. Dai. I think that she talked a little bit about this and some of the attempts China is making, and then perhaps Sergio, if you'd be willing to address this as well about your initiatives to do just this. Dr. Dai?
Okay, thank you. So that's payment for environmental service. That's my code. I code that. So actually, Chinese translate into the forest ecological benefits compensation fund. So actually, in China, forests has been divided in two camps. One is the economic, we call it economic-oriented forests. That's mainly for producing timber forests and economic products. And the others is a main parts divided into, we call protected forests. And for that forest, also divided into the national key, we call protected forests, and provincial protect forests. And for the national protected forests, that you can't clear cutting, and the managers can protect and also cultivate under the forest. That means can't damage the ecosystem. And for that kind of forest, can get the compensate from or the subsidy from the central funds. And for the provincial levels, can also from provincial public finance can give the subsidy for the protection of the forests. And also it's kind of compensate and protect. So although I said from the year 2001 to the year 2010, it's already input $5 billion US, but the level for this payment is still lower. It's just about 5 RMB for the state-owned forests, but for the farmers, collective farmers manage the forest can get 10 RMB. And also for the natural forest can also get the same level subsidy for the protected. So that's the system for the compensation. Okay.
Thank you, Sergio.
Well, at the Amazon Fund, we're beginning to deal with some projects now that are paying for services, environmental services, but for example, paying some communities in order to conserve the forest. But the big thing is not just giving the payment for the forest conservation, it's bringing the community to move along the process of living off the forest and not having in the future to depend on the payment. The forest is a potential livelihood, and there are many ecological services that could be paid. And I mean, you can imagine anything. Collecting spiders, for example, could be a livelihood for somebody. I mean, if you collect the venoms and provide and sell them to a pharmaceutical industry. So the ability to find out how the forest provides a livelihood and how that could be provided for, that's what we are trying to do. We're in the learning curve process of trying to identify the environmental services and find the way, the trajectory that have to be pursued in order to have the services stay there as a service and not as a payment forever. So the way out, you have to begin paying for some things, but you have to target the end of the process, which is the forest by itself being a sustainable project.
Thank you. Let me take say 3 questions, and then we'll ask our speakers. Right here in front, this lady here, and then the gentleman back. So right here.
My name is Faisal Parish, Global Environment Centre from Malaysia. I'd like to pick up on something that Pavan said about flooding, worries about flooding the market. And I've been working a long time on the issue of peatlands and peat swamp forest in Southeast Asia. And when we first raised the very great significance of this and the potential value of carbon finance to address this, we were told by the staff within the World Bank Forest Carbon Partnership that no, don't talk about that, because if you bring peatland to the market, it will lower the price of the market and destroy the value, because it can have too much carbon in those systems and the cost will be driven down. So I don't know whether we've resolved that or that's evolved in the thinking of the bank's programs, but I think it will be useful to have the comments of the panel what to do with these very high carbon stock systems to make sure that they remain in whatever system, and that they're preferentialized, but it doesn't disrupt the market. Thank you.
Thank you. We take note of that question. The lady here on my left. Thanks.
Pavan, you mentioned that it can't be fund or market, that needs to start with a fund and transfer to a market eventually. I wanted to ask, what do you think is the timeline for this transition? And also, what do you think will be the impacts on equity, such as poverty and biodiversity, within this transition?
So you're looking for a timeline from fund to private toward an independent system, which is what Sergio was describing. All right. The last one, there's a gentleman right in the back there. He's standing. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Dr. Parag. I'm a member of Indian Forest Service and presently working for FluxNet's monitoring in India. I have 2 questions, one for Pavan and the other for Dai. The first question is, are we considering the forestry sector as a primary sector for alleviating the poverty? Or the other way I can say it's whether can we consider this this poverty alleviation is a direct linkage with primary linkage with the forestry sector. And the other question to this Dai is, you have mentioned in a slide that there must be some correlation with the poverty alleviation and the ownership of state forest farms, state-owned forest farms. So, do you think that is there any direct relationship between the poverty and the ownership of the state-owned farms?
Thank you for those questions. So just to recap, one question had to do with whether there's a concern about flooding the market, particularly if we talk about multi-sectoral carbon. And secondly, a question about what sort of timeline are we looking at if we go from a fund to internalizing the costs in the marketplace. And finally, a provocative question, are forests a source of poverty alleviation? So let me ask each of the speakers in turn if they wish to address these questions. Sergio, can I start with you?
Yeah. I'll take this last one on the forest alleviating poverty. I tried to make the point that, I mean, with not so much money, you can provide communities with the possibility of introducing this system within the community. I mean, you have the institutional framework of doing the zoning. If suppose that a county, you tell counties in Brazil, if you do the zoning and if you train the local population to plant trees, you get the money from this fund. And the nursery will be introduced in your community. The nursery has technology, there's knowledge on how to do this. And then the community takes it on, plants trees. We see that people can get better returns than their subsistence levels just doing that. Once you recover the forest, you can set in the forest economy, which is large. So we're trying to find this out in the Amazon Fund. try to get the Amazon region to have a new economy. We are enthusiastic about it. We think there's so much knowledge hidden in the forest that in the future we will be able to have a new economy and maybe surpassing the rest. It's very important just to give you an idea that how we think that this will be doable. The bank just announced last week that we're going to do a second Amazon fund just with the BNDES money and some private equity investors to do just sustainable activities in the Amazon region. There's so many possibilities there, and we cannot do that with the Amazon fund money because the guidelines say we cannot give money to profit-taking enterprises, non-reimbursable money. So we're going to do this with the BNDES own money and other investors' money. And that will set in the new economy, this fishing, this phytotherapeuticals and nuts and chocolate and so much to do there. So there is this possibility, and this will alleviate poverty, just giving the jobs.
Thank you. Melinda?
Well, I'd like to speak to two issues. First of all, flooding the market. If you have a price for carbon, the market, in theory, will equilibrate. But if you have some places with no price and a lot of carbon offsets, obviously in the short term, you have a market that's shallow and highly volatile. So the real issue globally is how do we develop carbon prices either nationally or even internationally, the goal originally of the Kyoto Protocol. And I think we're moving on a track where we're going to have multiple markets and they're going to develop over time and they'll take time. Peatlands get to another point in my presentation. Some forest lands are actually going to be more valuable than others. $7 to $8 a ton. I personally think that price versus all the opportunity costs of other uses for the land might not be sufficient to keep those lands in forests. And that's why we need to figure out other things that those forests are doing and structure broader markets in the ecosystem to realize the other benefits that we're getting to. And we're just at the beginning of developing these systems of valuation. I believe in 10 years there will be a dramatic difference. A lot of these markets will be operating very actively, but other markets, particularly markets directed towards social gains, may require subsidies for some time.
Pavan.
Sure, I'll try and answer. I think the poverty question has been well addressed already. And yes, it is absolutely about poverty. Forests and natural capital are the wealth of the poor, and there is no way in which we can have a development policy without recognizing biodiversity as a component. Let me come to the flooding question and pick off from where you left off in terms of the peatlands. Firstly, let's step back and recognize that at current levels of economic use of fossil fuels and of current levels of deforestation and so on, business as usual would lead us to something like a 56 gigaton emissions level by 2020, as against current levels of about 42, 43. And where we want to target in order to move on the trajectory that takes us to a 2 degrees safety level is more like 44 gigatons. So by our estimates, therefore, we have what we call a gigaton gap of 12 gigatons. Okay? So I posit that the problem here is not whether or not there are a lot of potential carbon emissions from peatlands which could be avoided, or whether the reward of saving peatlands is insufficient, but rather that we need to be much more ambitious in the targets that we are setting ourselves. So we are really suffering what is not just a gigaton gap, but an ambition gap. And that's, I guess, what we are all here for in Cancun. If we address that ambition gap, then I have absolutely no fear that there will be flooding of any kind. And in fact, I would see today's carbon prices, be it $7, $8 or 15, 20 euros or whatever they are, as still very far away from what I would describe as the social cost of carbon. And Lord Stern's review a few years ago had estimated that at something like $85 a ton. So we are not talking about anything close to the level of carbon pricing that we need to really address the true economic costs of carbon emissions. So I think there's a lot to go, and today I would see even the best market, in fact the only serious market, is the EU ETS. In my opinion, the caps set by the EU ETS are timid. They are timid at the best of times, and I think we have to recognize that part of the reasons why we see collapses in these prices is because there just isn't enough pressure to push them to where they belong. So that's as far as the flooding issue is concerned in peatlands. Your question, ma'am, in terms of transition time, recognizing that the transition is going to be different for different aspects of a fund and aspects of the marketplace. Let's talk for a moment about just tropical forest carbon. To be honest, because there are many dimensions to this, there's ecosystem services of many kinds that we have to capture, and then there's clearly different components of the landscape that we have to capture. Let's begin with the simplest level and say, let's just look at the carbon ecosystem, carbon storage ecosystem service, and let's just look at only tropical forests. I would consider a 2 to 5 year period as being appropriate for a fund phase, and I would consider a 3 to 7 year period as being appropriate to target a realistic market phase. And that's on the basis of my understanding of what can work if we truly commit ourselves to it. A lot of the time gap here is about building capacity and building the infrastructures that are required, and recognizing that unless you have a critical mass of key players, then the kind of exploratory fund-based phase that I'm talking about when I describe fund-based phases will simply not happen, because you do need time for capacity to be built and explorations and price discovery to take place through bilateral agreements, which then gradually move to a situation where you don't have to sit with 190 countries around the table to figure out what is the right performance levels, because you've achieved that already. There are lots of dotted points along the path of the fund, and you've had price discovery effectively by a market mimicking system. So 2 to 5 years would be just for tropical forest carbon, just for the carbon storage. In order to achieve what we are all talking about here as a fair, equitable approach towards forest-based compensations and landscape-based compensations, obviously you need to magnify those times.
Thank you. Dai, would you like to answer one of the questions?
Okay. Concerning the poverty alleviation, the peoples live the poor peoples live mountainous areas. So means collectives actually is nobody own the forest. So for that farmers, they just own a few farmlands. So not enough to maintain their livelihood. So since the year 2008, so actually 3 years pilot in some province, and government support to the collective forest reform. That means contract the forest land to the farmer households. Then they can manage the forest and can get the economic output. And also, if they manage the protected forest, they can get the subsidy from the government. And also another kind of poverty alleviation, that's we call conversion the cropland to the forest. And that kind of croplands I call it marginal lands, because that's the very steep slopes, the mountain lands, and also the lands in desertification. So that kind of output is actually unstable yield. So the farmers also poor, and the government encouraged the farmers to convert their land to forests. Then they can get the subsidy both the seedling and the cash. In 2-3 years ago, they can get grain, but now they can also directly get the cash. So that subsidy is until to they get substitute livelihood. So that's the big programs for the conversion. We call it ecological construction, but also it's a kind of a programs poverty alleviation. And concerning the state-owned forest farm, so actually since 1994, they don't have the input from the government, and it just the land and forest is belong to the government, but they manage themselves. They can get the income from cutting the trees. But since 1998, most of the forests in the state-owned forest farms become a logging ban. So they just can get some subsidy, from the compensation fund, but not enough support their livelihood. The salaries of the workers is lower than average land in that area, the local, and also they like road construction, like water supply, like electricity equipment, things like that. So it's we call it a poor, even lower in some areas, lower than the farm households. So the recent years, the government gave some reform in the state-owned forest farm, also gave a big input for the construction, road, house, and water supply, and things like that. So also give some subsidy for them to get social insurance. So I call that is a kind of a poverty alleviation for the state-owned forests. So
Thank you, Di.
I hope I answered your question.
Warren, I give you the last word.
Thanks, and I'm just going to, I don't know, there was a question early on about adaptation as well, and I think that, and I was surprised that Pavan didn't pick up on this real quick, because I think what we're looking at is a situation where we're going to be learning by doing for quite some time. I'm worried that we're going to make this whole stuff so complicated that we're going to learn how to not do it instead of learn how to do it. And things like understanding the real values of what forests deliver, whether it's biodiversity values or indeed sustained water yields, soil conservation, which are extremely important for adaptation for downstream communities to a changing climate, to poverty alleviation. If we wait until we figure all this stuff out and structure it in some market, then we're never going to get anywhere. So I think what we've got to really do is focus on using the resources that are available. And Faisal, I don't know how you flood a market if you don't have one. We don't have one. I think the introduction of REDD Plus is perhaps going to really make one, but it's going to be public sector, a lot of bilateral deals for some time. We've got to take advantage of the next few years while that kind of money is flowing in to the countries where all of us are working, to really try and figure this stuff out, do the best we can to get values on carbon, on biodiversity, on other ecosystem services, and set up ways that you can reasonably measure and so on, and without overcomplicating the system that we've seen in the CDM, so that when there is a real market, you have something that will work. And I don't know what the time frame is. I wish I did, but I think we've got about 3 or 4 years to show that you can really start bringing these values together. Some of them are of international value, others are of domestic value, national, local, and so on. So I think we've got a lot of work to do, but we've got a great opportunity in the next few years because of what is happening around the climate agenda. And so we need to link it closely to that, but keep our eye on the broader issues, and particularly, I think, on the valuation issue. Thanks.
Thank you, Warren.